Righty. Today I want to talk about children being raised today. I know I'm not like the best, what do you want to call it, like maybe the best advocate for this, since I'm 24, single, and I don't have any kids, no baby mamas. And specifically, I want to talk about raising kids to preserve their innocence, and raising kids to, be able to survive and live on their own and kind of be empowered in that way. And I want to kind of reach a middle ground with it too and find understanding for both sides. So the majority of kids nowadays are either one or the other. They either have their innocence so preserved that they don't know what to do once they grow into adulthood. And on the other hand, you have kids who are not innocent at all. And I mean not innocent at all in the sense of no one protected them at all from the world. And I know of quite a few people who had their innocence stripped away from them very early on in their childhood, where they didn't really get a say-so in that. There's been kids who and being stripped away of your innocence can mean a lot of things. It can mean sexual assault or abuse or rape or whatever, but it can also mean being exposed to very traumatic events at a young age. Obviously now that I'm 24, and I've seen a little bit, I was able to kind of get through certain traumatic and events like that. But when you're a kid, you handle them differently. I wouldn't even say you handle them differently. You don't really handle them well at all. So most kids that I see that go through traumatic events early on in their childhood and kind of get their innocence stripped away from them in that sense tend to grow up very bitter in the way that they would inflict whatever emotional trauma, pain that they have built up inside of them, and they would kind of inflict it on a lot of other people. And I've seen a lot of that in various settings, like in the jail and certain security jobs that I've worked, and even just regular jobs where I've seen people and I kind of get to talking to them and I hear more about their background story. But likewise, on the other hand, you would see people who never got exposed to anything, whether it's the mother that's coddling them or the father that's just absent or not in the home, whatever it is. There's also something to be said about that. And sometimes those people are the ones that cause even more damage and pain in society. And I'll get into that. So on one hand, you have the person who's experienced a lot at childhood, and you have on the other hand the one that's been coddled and never been exposed to anything. I know a lot of people would like to really harp on the people that have never been exposed to anything and kind of say like, oh, you don't know because you haven't experienced X, Y, and Z. You haven't experienced this, that, and the other. You've been you've been so privileged all throughout your life. Privileged in one way, but disprivileged in another way. Okay, and they both do have a lot of things that they need to figure out. The person that had their innocence stripped away from them early on in their childhood, they have something to deal with where they need to learn to unpack those emotions, and stop finding that character, whoever it may be, that did strip away them from their innocence. They'll find those characters all throughout society, and they'll kind of target them in a way, even though they don't really know them personally. They don't know their background story. They don't know the traumatic events that went on, but they see that person and mentally they say like, man, that's who did it. That's who did it. And they have all this rage pent up to where they just don't know really how to manage their emotions and how to manage those events, and they need to unpack those events. And same thing with those who were coddled their entire life, and when I mean really coddled, I mean they usually, more often than not, were raised on the internet. And we're kind of exposed to whatever in that way. Often you see that as a result of these sort of prank videos where you have these kids that don't really know any boundaries. Like they've never had anyone that's really like hard set their boundaries in front of them. You know, like there's a like my friend in high school, he used to always say, like, man, like everyone's gotten too comfortable talking crap online and not getting punched in the face for it. And you know, there is a little bit of truth to that, but I also do think there's a more like productive route of going about things where like you don't have to punch anyone in the face for it. But and I think on both sides you kind of need to be understanding for one another. The parents, yeah, are a result of this. I would say most of the time parents are a result of this, and you know, whether or not millennial parents would want to take responsibility for this, you know, that's up to them. I can't force them to admit to anything, to say anything, and you know, they have the truth of how the kid was raised, and they have the knowledge, and I don't. So it's up to them to be truthful in that sense. But on one hand, now I want to talk about how the kids were raised on each side, and now get into kind of like the middle ground that I think should be more positioned for a child to be raised in. So on one end, I'll start with the people that were coddled first. So people on one end that are coddled, they are raised by the internet. They never have any accountability because the parents are very much of, we have to preserve their innocence at all costs, and really to the detriment of other people around them that when they grow into adulthood can't really, you know, be an adult with them. And so since they're coddled, since they're spoiled, since they have gotten anything and everything that they wanted, they kind of bring that into society and expect that from everybody else, because like that's all that they know. And then later down the line, society has to raise their kids, and sometimes those spoiled kids, those, you know, I know older people call them brats, whatever you want to call them, those kids later down the line, later running into a wall that is adulthood in society, and specifically other people that say like, okay, this person needs to learn to have some respect, and they get hurt. You know, that whether or not it's they get talked down to, or they get made fun of, they get ridiculed, or whatever it is, that stumps them from kickstarting and going into adulthood and actually not only becoming a productive member of society, although I don't think your worth is defined by your productivity, but also being able to set goals for themselves that make sense and something that like a purpose that they truly want to go down, and not just one that their parents would kind of coddle them and say like, you can do whatever, you can be astronaut on the moon, you can be a billionaire, Elon Musk, whatever, but just a goal that you can say like, hey, let's be realistic about this, but you can do anything that you set your mind to. Okay, now on the flip side, the parents that kind of are responsible for the innocence of the child being stripped away. These parents typically, more often than not, and they're not always responsible for it, sometimes there are just tragic events that happen in the world, but these parents typically are a lot more selfish. They're a lot more selfish, and they more often than not aren't really grounded in something that's bigger than themselves. They're very much of themselves, at least from my experience. Whereas a lot of times these parents typically are raising these kids in single parent households, and they're in the bar scene, they're in the dating scene. They tend to leave the kid by himself more often than not, which in turn leaves the kid alone, lonely, and searching for something that they don't know what, but they know that they're missing, which typically is a connection. And in that case, it would be a connection with whoever's raising them in that single parent household. And I've heard countless stories. I have some stories of my own that I won't share, but I have heard stories of people where they're left alone, and you know, they just go they're bored, they don't have anything to do, and you know, video games can, or maybe they're too poor to even have video games, where they kind of go walking down the block and they find a group of kids who's open to kind of bringing them in, and maybe they see like his circumstance, his situation of maybe the parents are arguing, or maybe they see that he's left alone and he has his innocence. They want to kind of bring him in to, you know, provide him that protection. And in turn, as they grow old with him and as they grow up with him, they slowly, and sometimes not even slowly, but more often than not, they slowly kind of introduce said kid, said individual into more of what they're actually about, whether it's the drug scene, whether it's gangs, whether it's violence. More often than not, it is the drug game, because that's just, it's quick money, it's fast money, and a lot of people are just like this kid who's grew up in a single parent household, had their innocence stripped away from them. And that's also why you see in those hoods, in those environments, they don't like predators or chomos or anything like that. And of course, nobody does, but they especially don't. They especially don't so much that they will commit violence onto them. And that's why you see that in the jails, the prisons, all over across the United States. And then these kids typically grow up to either be repeat offenders in the jails, prisons, homeless, frequent flyers in places like hospitals, homeless camps, and hooked on drug addictions due to that kind of background where their innocence was stripped. But now I want to get into the middle ground of it, because I believe, because it's not always that parents willingly know what they're doing. Sometimes they're oblivious to it, sometimes they're ignorant to it. But I do believe there is that middle ground where, where you can raise the kid with hardships and not strip their innocence away from them, which again, I know some parents are kind of oblivious to that. Some parents don't even know about that. Some parents are ignorant. And a lot of it has to do with single parent households. The splitting of the woman or the wife and the husband in the, what do you want to call it? In the household, where the wife used to stay at home and tend to the kids and raise her how she believes, which usually is backed by faith or any sort of religion like that. And the husband is kind of like the character in the household that everyone looks up to in a way. And don't get me wrong, I have heard people say like, oh, well, like the husband was always abusive in that circumstance. But the kids ended up better, even though, they kind of grew up in that abusive household, which wasn't super common. But even then, the average kid was very well off. I believe that the kid can have their innocence stripped away from them, but not in a way that's, I guess stripped is the wrong word, but their innocence replaced with responsibilities, with adulthood, whatever it is. You can do this in many ways, where you have the kid join extracurricular activities, but not so much forcing them to, but really showing them like the potential fruits of the labor in whatever it is, whether it's wrestling, whether it's practicing the various instruments, guitar, trombone, saxophone, or pursuing a career, pursuing maybe even entrepreneurship in like a business, and really just kind of learning to endure those hardships, which inherently takes away your innocence because you kind of have that responsibility to bear. But it's not so much like a traumatic event. It's not a traumatic event where your innocence is actually stripped away from you, but it's more of just like you have a higher calling than, sitting in like your mom's basement and like being mean, being bitter, being like not knowing how to respect people's boundaries in that way. And in turn, the child has a grounding in his innocent nature, but also he respects people's boundaries, which I know both sides, when they end up growing up, they don't respect anyone's boundaries and they become more of like a nuisance to society, which I don't believe they're like, I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying like there's no hope for them or that they're garbage in today's society. But what I am saying is that I believe that they would be a lot happier, more well off if they did pursue something bigger. But anyways, I think that's all I got to talk about. All right, God bless.